Hey there, Georgie here with Ukraine Matters. Russia is being hit exactly where it hurts. Russian propagandist trip to United States backfires impressively. US sanctions are already causing massive effect on the Russian industries. And talking about Russian industries, their defense sector is really struggling. We have a lot of news, not a lot of time, so let's begin our Ukraine Daily News show. Explosions shake Moscow as drones are approaching the Russian capital. Russian capital has been targeted by Ukrainian drones on the night of the 26th of October. While Russians are reporting that everything was fine, everything was shut down, this indicates a very big departure from Ukrainians targeting assets outside of Moscow. And while these targets are on fire all across Russia, Moscow itself remained a relatively safe spot from the Ukrainian drone strikes. Well, not anymore. Moscow officials in the same breath are both claiming that all Ukrainian drones were shut down and there is no reason to panic, as well as trying to show that some of the residential buildings were supposedly hit by Ukrainian drones. Though further investigation suggests that most likely it has been some of the Russian air defense assets operating in the area that have a history of striking own buildings for one reason or another. Moscow itself is one of the densest spot of concentration of anti-air assets. Here you can see the map that has various types of air defenses, including the S-300 missile interceptor, including the Panzer systems and other types of anti-air assets placed inside of Moscow. And as you can see, there is quite a lot of this. And I truly believe that strikes against Moscow are primarily there to scare Putin and to put additional pressure on Russia. Most likely, I think that they thought that it was enough air defense already in Moscow, so they were willing to place that air defense somewhere else in the country. And Ukrainians just want to kind of refresh the memory for Russians that no, it is not enough. So the main purpose, I believe, of putting some of these drones into the Moscow area is to get more into air defense into the area, exposing other parts of Russia. But you know how they call this situation when a country that you were supposed to capture in 3 days, 3.5 years later, suddenly is starting to strike your capital and you are forced to move air defense there to protect the glorious leader. They call it the good beginning, because Ukrainians repeated the strikes against Moscow the second night in the row. I don't think that this is ever going to stop, and I think it's going to get worse and worse and worse for Russians. And Putin should start getting really afraid. Especially because this is an example of the Russian mobile anti-air group that is defending Moscow. And from the outside, you kind of like, yeah, I mean, this looks fine, right? You know, it's a car and with a machine gun. Yeah, that's like they're trying to protect whatever, do whatever they can. But when you start looking a little bit closer, then you start realizing, oh, wait, no, this is actually really bad. Because you might notice that this machine gun doesn't have any scope whatsoever. Also, you don't see any major equipment for the guys. So like no night vision, no thermal sights, nothing that can really help detect drones over the night sky. These guys are at least 3 years behind Ukrainian mobile fighter groups that are fighting the Russian drones. These guys, I don't know what they're going to shut down. Probably just inhabitants of Moscow. And as I was preparing to wrap up this topic, 2 news came out. News number 1, that apparently right now there is an ongoing strike for the 3rd night in a row of Ukrainian drones against Moscow. And second thing is there is a video suggesting that it's not just a simple drone strike that is going around Moscow and Moscow region. Reports are that this is during the yesterday's drone attack on Moscow. In the same area, it was captured a video of flying Ukrainian Flamingo missile against some targets inside Russia. As you can see, the missile is flying and it's on its way to do its job. So I'm pretty sure there's just a lot of things being done inside Russia that we just don't get the reports on. Last week we talked about Kremlin stooge Kirill Dmitriev flying very fast to United States to talk with Steve Witkoff in an attempt to change the policy of United States on imposing sanctions on Russia. This unfortunately backfired severely, as first Kirill Dmitriev talked with Witkoff. Unfortunately for him, at the same time, everyone of importance were completely out of Washington. And more than that, after his talks with Witkoff, he also made a couple of interviews with statements to US media. And his comments were actually addressed by the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent after that. And it was devastating for Kremlin, if I can say so. Dmitriev was regarded as Russian propagandist, and in general, the statements were not super favorable to Moscow. Bessent said, quote, I mean, what else is he gonna say? That, it's gonna be terrible, and it's gonna bring Putin to the table, question mark. The Russian economy is a wartime economy. Growth is virtually zero. Inflation, I believe, is over 20%. Russian officials are claiming inflation of 9%. And everything we do is going to bring Putin to the table. It's our oil that funds the Russian war machine, and I think we can make a substantial dent in his profits. This highlights that whatever numbers Russia is putting forward in the economy, it's not really being believed by a lot of people in the United States. Quote, I don't know what he and Witkoff discussed, but I doubt the visit will yield much for Moscow. And frankly, Dmitriev's messaging and some of the meeting he took just come across as pathetic and tone deaf. And this is surprisingly clear because statements by Dmitriev have been pretty manipulative and are trying to essentially sway the narrative towards Russia without changing anything and giving an inch from Moscow. Dmitriev is not the person that can state change the messages from Russia. Dmitriev is just there to try to appeal to some of the aspects of Trump and Witkoff that they seem to be responding to. Let's look at a couple of the quotes and I'll explain what exactly do I mean. Quote, it is a big move by President Zelensky to already acknowledge that this is about battle lines, Dmitriev said. You know, his previous position was that Russia should leave completely. So actually, I think we are reasonably close to a diplomatic solution that we can be worked out. This is, of course, manipulation just to kind of put Russia in a good light. Because in reality, President Zelensky from day one stated that we should be fighting the war on diplomatic front rather than in reality. President Zelensky was ready to stop fighting and stop firing day one. If you don't believe me, you can try Googling for the dates and the addresses that President Zelensky did first month, especially towards the Russian. But he has been echoing the same over this whole period of war. The whole narrative that Russia and that Ukraine wants to fight this until they return to 1999 borders, I don't know where it comes from. And as a second example, here he talked about the possible negotiations with United States with the war in Ukraine. Quote, it is certainly only possible if Russia's interests are taken into account and treated with respect, Dmitriev stated to Reuters. Here we hear a couple of Kremlin keywords that essentially mean the Russian interest is what Russia has stated. Give us the regions that we have written into our constitution. Ukraine should also be demilitarized, no joining NATO, and also NATO should be removing their assets from Europe. This is what has been described about Russian interest. If you want to find out more about Russian interest and what Russia puts in the keyword Russian interest, Google in 2021, before war started, Putin made a whole demand list, like an ultimatum, to NATO. This is Putin's program that he wants to go for. He talked a lot of other manipulative things, such as security guarantees for Ukraine. In Russian perspective, that means that Russia will be the security guarantor for Ukraine. Yes, that's the initial proposal, and other things. So knowing that, it's very nice to see that we see from US administration response response that is very, very clear on how Dmitriev is perceived, and his statements should be disregarded. And talking about sanctions, while it is true that sanctions are still not coming into full force, we already see the effects. This is what I mean by when I said that US had all the cards. It is a lot of these cards, just mentioning that you will play these cards, they will already have effects because other players will try to respond just because US has so much weight. So when United States stated that they will sanction the top 2 Russian companies that account about 30% of Russian oil exports, then already we see companies from India responding to this potential threat because it would actually hurt them, and they are already canceling the orders. So potentially, yes, sanctions are not in the effect de facto yet, but the effects of these sanctions are already happening. What we need to understand is that these top 2 that are being sanctioned, those are some of the last Russian oil companies. They used this competitive advantage, stating, hey, all of the other Russian oil companies are being sanctioned except us 2, so invest into us. And sanctioning the top 5 Russian companies right now that will be going on the list once the sanctions rolled in, means that over 75% of Russian oil production and exports are going to be under sanctions. It is a massive blow. And another massive blow as an effect, again, to the sanctions is that Greek tanker fleet that was carrying over 40%, I believe, of Russian seaborne crude. The Greek fleet, despite all support for Ukraine and European pressure and whatever, and what was still doing this work for Russia, is finally abandoning the Russian oil trade. It pains me that this is still the case, but at least we're getting there. And there has been multiple strikes against Russian oil refineries. I will not go over it. It's just taking way too long. The only thing that I want to mention is that these strikes are happening nonstop. Magyar, as this is his campaign through and through, is causing an absolute havoc on the Russian oil refinery business industries. They're trying desperately to protect it, but it's just not working out. Recent estimates are stating that over 27% of Russian fuel output are completely lost by this point and will not be coming back in the near future. The 27% is only due to the drone strikes. Russia has been neglecting a lot of refinery refurbishment for a long time over the last couple of years, and a lot of them are just coming offline because Russia is trying to push extra power out of them, and they're just breaking. And to put it in a simple perspective, since the start of the year, Russian fuel prices have risen over 60%. So imagine the start of this year and then add 60% on top of it. Yeah, that is a lot. That is a huge, huge increase in fuel prices. And just think about how this will impact the whole economy. And just when you thought that Putin is the ultimate King Anti-Midas that turns to shit everything that he touches, we now get this gem over here. We have a table of data showing the performance of Russian industry and specifically into the military industry. So I know this is in Cyrillic, so bear with me here. So what we are looking here is important. This is Russian performance of the industry in percentage year-to-year growth. So in 2022, the first line is the ready metal production. So essentially artillery shells. Think about artillery shells. So artillery shells from the 2022 reports grew 13.4% year on year. In 2023, the growth was 26.4%. And then in 2024, compared to previous year, the growth was 31.6%, which makes sense. Russia is in the warfare, intense warfare. They need to make more money. They need to invest in their output and production of their military industry, especially in the attrition warfare, where you need to raise the plank every time one up your opponent, because otherwise you're just getting screwed. Well, we now have data for the first 9 months of 2025, which is located right over here. And as you can see, the first line, the growth is only 15.3%. I mean, it's obviously going to grow in the last 3 months, but it's not going to go over 30%. And it's not going to even go over 26%. More than that, specifically in September, the last month, you see that it was actually negative. Putin was able to make sure that Russian military industry is going downwards in a wartime. How can you mess up military production decreasing during the wartime? And I mean, you can see it very clearly. For example, most of these bottom ones is the civilian industries. You see that it's completely going downwards, especially this 19.9% minus. This is the automotive industry. So the sales of cars in Russia and so on. Production of cars in Russia. It is going downhill. It is bad. It is really terrible. I'm going to move myself so you can see. It is all in the red. Russia is doing terribly. And I mean, these are Russian official numbers. So they are most likely also cooked upwards, if you know what I mean. Insane, absolute insanity. And Russia also is not having a good time at the front line. We have reports that another Russian helicopter has now been shot down. In some of the recent Russian attacks, it was noted that Russia is actually using women to storm Ukrainian positions. This is new because beforehand, there was very little women present on the front line. If they were present, maybe as a capacity of a medic teams or maybe support or driver, stuff like that, you know, like support functions. But this time, no, there are specifically videos of Russians using women to attack Ukrainian positions. And this is absolutely new and might suggest that Russians are getting more desperate, or potentially these are the women from the Russian penal colonies that we're seeing. Some good news for Ukraine, very briefly. Nordic countries are uniting for a joint procurement of drones. Nordic countries, big supporters of Ukraine, are doing a lot. And now there's going to be some kind of a new mechanism that will allow a joint procurement of drones. Very good news, because to be honest, Nordic countries are some of the richest countries in Europe, and they will definitely be benefiting Ukraine a lot. Ukraine is agreeing to United Kingdom to have a joint production of their interceptor. Recently, we saw the Octopus 100 interceptor demonstrated to President Zelensky, and this interceptor is pretty good to fight against Shaheeds and other aerial threats. Following up great news from last week of Sweden aiming to sell 120 or more planes to Ukraine. Now we're hearing that Saab is actually considering establishing a fighter jet production facility in Ukraine. This is crazy. If this is indeed true, then we might see Gripen production take off, and we might see Gripen become one of the more dominant plane that will be present in European skies in medium to longer terms. And to finish today's episode off, you know, oftentimes I say it's gonna get worse and worse for Russia. President Zelensky stated that Ukraine is gonna expand the geography of long-range strikes on Russia. And it came out less as a statement and more as a promise. So here is the promise from Zelensky. It's gonna get worse and worse for Russia. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you haven't done so, click subscribe button. It helps elevate the video in YouTube algorithms so more people can see it. Support Ukraine. Trust in Ukrainian armed forces. I love you. Slava Ukraini, and I will see you next time.
I see